All right, so we've got some diagrams here. Won't go too deep into this thing, but this is the typical on-premise deployment. I've got schools here because we do a lot of work for schools, and but if you're a commercial, someone in the commercial market, you can think of these as different sites, different locations. So we might have here, and I'll just there we go. So we've got two sites here, right? And I say admin building in high school. In the commercial world, that might be your primary, like your HQ, and this might be like a DR site or another significant location. And we have a voice/SIP gateway. And those are going to be the way that you terminate, the way the public switch telephone network ingresses your VoIP system, where you get your telephone service. So it's centralized, but it is redundant in this model. And so again, you may have some of your on-premise phone system, which works on a clustering, highly available, like a redundant clustering array. You might have half of it at one site, half of it on the other site. And then your more remote sites, those would be a candidate for the survivability gateway. This is where you might want to have one or two of those POTS lines there. And that's PSTN redundancy, but you may also have some sort of meshing internet connection or an alternate internet circuit. But the remote site is where the survivability becomes important. And there in green, you can see that's essentially the survivability link between those two, and this is kind of the PSTN cloud. So that's the on-prem deployment. Again, this is, it's kind of the obvious. This is the pure cloud model where you have a site, you have one or more phones, they go through the internet to get phone service. That's the end of the story. Relatively simple. Okay, so here's a diagram where we have the cloud-based system, but you had SIP service already, and you had a Cisco gateway already. Or maybe you have specific needs for that SIP service, or they have a pricing model that works better for your organization. So it just makes more sense for you to have your own PSTN connection, one or more, at your locations. And the WebEx calling does that. So here we see we still have, this looks just kind of like the first diagram I showed you, where you still have a SIP gateway at both of the major locations. And then here at a remote site, you can still have that survivability gateway. And this all still works with the cloud system. And then here I also have a pair of the paging servers, and those are also on premise. Moving on, so this we haven't talked about yet, but this is a cloud system that has a cloud PSTN provider. So phone service is provided through WebEx calling. And in this case, your connection to the PSTN goes through the internet at all locations. But the thing to note here is that at all three locations, we still have a survivability gateway. And there might be a POTS line or two at each. So if that internet connection does break, or if one or more internet connections break that are meshed, you can still get dial tone. All right, so kind of moving on to the advantage and how we enable your remote workers or your hybrid workers. We've got a bit of a comparison here. The on-premise system, just the traditional on-premise system, the endpoints only work within the borders of the corporate network. And traditional PSTN connection, if you were looking at a hub and spoke model for an HQ and remote offices, that PSTN connection, sometimes it's distributed, but a lot of times we see it's centralized. And then instant messaging, meetings, that all works within the corporate boundaries, doesn't work on the internet. And traditionally, a VPN could be used to extend these services. Traditionally, it is not designed to do that. Sometimes you have to deal with packet encapsulation overhead, all sorts of geeky stuff, but it is not always the right delivery device for voice services. So how do we enable the on-premise system to enable the hybrid workers, the remote workers? So when I talked about that edge gateway, in the Cisco on-prem collab world, that is called Expressway. And Expressway is, in its most basic form, it's a pair of servers. You've got one that's inside the network and one that is in a DMZ. And what it does is it facilitates a secure tunnel. It's a secure firewall traversal tool. And we'll see a diagram that illustrates that a little bit. And what that will allow is the endpoints, be it desk phones or soft phones, to work on the public internet. So also, in this model, it might be advantageous to have PSTN connection at HQ, but perhaps also a colo, like a DR site, and that can provide that redundancy in a centralized PSTN connection. So with the unified communication system, the WebEx app can be used, and it essentially just using that out of the box, it has cloud, instant messaging, team spaces, and basic meetings. That does not require any additional configuration. It just does it. And WebEx is definitely a kind of a key difference, because out of the box, it uses encryption. It uses some of the security features that we're going to hear a little bit more about. The Expressway. Here's a diagram, roughly how that works. You can see here there are a pair of firewalls. There isn't always this one, right? We want there to be that one, but that one doesn't always exist. Sometimes DMZ is like an air-gapped subnet, that's on its own switch somewhere. We see that, and that works just fine. But you've got a core inside the network, and you've got an edge in the DMZ, and the core initiates an outbound session to the edge. And so it creates this tunnel, and it uses TLS. You have to get CA signed certificates. So it initiates an outbound tunnel to the edge, and then that tunnel is open, and then through some DNS service discovery lookups with your when you log into the service on the internet, it then points at the Expressway edge, and through that tunnel that's being held open with keep alives from the inside out, those voice sessions, those registrations, they can come back into the corporate network and be anchored there. The Expressway core and edge can also be clustered and can also be made redundant. So if it's a crucial service for your business, that can work. So the question is, how else do we secure that stuff, right? The Expressway, cool, that makes everything work on the internet, but what about securing what we already have? So y'all seen Shrek, right? Ogres are like onions, or like phone systems, maybe. It's a layered approach, right? So in no particular order, this all rides atop the network, your existing network infrastructure. And as you may be aware, there's a vast amount of security services that can improve the security of that network. And since we ride on top of that, you also enhance the security of the VoIP system when you enhance the security of your network. Within unified communications specifically, there are security features that can be enabled. You can have secure SIP, so that's the signaling that does phone SRTP, which is, RTP is the real-time protocol. That's your actual audio, your voice. So that can be secured and encrypted. You can have your phones only trust your call manager, and that can be done through the use of certificates with TLS. And you can also integrate single sign-on. If you have an identity provider, you can have your call manager your WebEx, you can have that trust that, and then maybe you have multi-factor enabled on that. Well, as long as it's enabled on that, it's enabled for VoIP, because the call manager will trust your SSO. So I'm sure we can't get through this presentation without Jason mentioning multi-factor authentication, so that will work. And then there are also some elements within the dial plans. So without getting really nerdy on you, I'll just say there are ways to filter, to block certain area codes, to block the naughty numbers. You can use codes, give everyone long distance rights, but use codes to allow international calling. Do things like keep tabs, create a policy that makes it so people who forward their phone can only forward it to long distance numbers, because there's all sorts of ways the bad guys like to do toll fraud and forward out to international numbers and whatnot. I don't know why they do that. I don't really have anyone to talk to internationally, but I don't know. And then lastly is educating users about phone scams and social engineering. My cohort might talk a little bit more about the social engineering here, but obviously it kind of starts with the user, right? If we make the users aware, yeah, there are people out there that are trying to call people so they can grab voice samples and use AI to recombine your voice and all sorts of wild stuff that all used to be sci-fi but it's now real. Making users aware of that and how to deal with that is part of the Shrek approach here. So the advantages of WebEx, I've touched on a lot of these. A couple of them that I haven't mentioned is that you can use existing Cisco hardware to do this. If you have an investment in 7800, 8800 Cisco phones, you can use firmware that will convert, and then they will register to WebEx calling. And in the hybrid model, we can do this firmware migration to and from. And so, if you have an investment in like PoE paging speakers, analog gateways, Cisco ISR routers, they all can be used with WebEx calling. The security, and then NSI and TAC both support both solutions. So this place where you're going to get support for your existing call manager, it's going to remain the same for WebEx calling. There's quite a deep API system for WebEx in general. I won't go into that, but there is a developer website that you can go to, and it's really pretty incredible. And again, I haven't touched on it, but licensing, the Flex, and some of you might be familiar with the Flex contract, but the Flex is designed, I think it's called Flex because it lets you either license your on-premise system or your cloud system or both. And so, we think about licensing in Cisco and it's a big eye-rolling thing. But the reality is that it is the most flexible licensing model that I've seen in my years of doing it that allow you access to all of those systems at the same time. So you get to make the choices. Both of these systems can be used where it makes sense for your operation to either, you've got an existing system, you extend it out to the internet, you extend it out so your collab services can be had anywhere, or you can have a hybrid model where you have on-prem, you have cloud where it makes sense, or those who are looking for a full cloud solution, you can have that, but you can also have those anchors on-premise where you can have things like survivability. And you really can pick and choose from any of those things with this solution. So, a segue, security, like I said, is a key differentiator for the Cisco product. It's used by a lot of government entities. It can be programmed to fit compliance for high security environments. And again, securing collab, part of that is also securing the network.